All right. Okay. I am occasionally going to be letting folks in. Tonight, we are going to talk about tomatoes. So I appreciate everybody coming to check out this presentation. This is the first time that I will have used that, and it's one that possibly I will use at the North Atlanta Home Show. So hopefully it will be well received. It's got a lot of really good information, all sorts of stuff about just tomatoes in general. So if you're a new gardener, that's great. There's going to be some information here that is probably going to be new and interesting to you. And if you're an experienced gardener, there's still going to be some information that you had that you probably didn't know you needed. And there's always, as always, lots of good information that you can hit up on publications. I've got a lot of QR codes in here. Please don't feel like you need to actually go visit each of them when they're on the slide. The whole point of recording these is so that I can post them over at the Metro Master Gardener YouTube channel, and you can go over there and you can check it out as much as you would like. So I will go ahead and start. I am recording this again, as I mentioned. I have muted everybody, I think, but if you come in and for whatever reason, I missed you for some odd reason and you are not muted, please go ahead and mute yourself. If you have a question that pops up over the course of this particular program, feel free to drop that in the chat box, and I will get to that at the end and answer whatever questions you have at that point. And I will go ahead and start. All right, so we are all here to talk about tomatoes. I think they're probably one of the most favorite garden vegetables. I put that in quotes because it's technically a fruit out there. Everybody seems to love tomatoes. Everyone wants to grow them in their garden. If they don't grow them out in their garden, they're growing them in a pot on their back deck. They are part of a larger family, the Solanaceae family, and that's also eggplants, peppers, potatoes, tobacco, and petunias. So if you ever look at the leaves of any of those other plants, you'll note they all kind of look alike. And that's because they're in the same family. So now you know if that was something that you didn't know. They are also considered a tropical plant from South and Central America. So if you ever wondered why you can't grow them here in the wintertime, that's why. They are an annual plant. A tender, warm season plant, but they do marvelously here for the most part in your garden. And as long as you control a few factors, and those would be like disease and insects and some other things. Average days to maturity, there are so many different varieties out there, and they seem to be adding new ones every year. But that's going to be 65 days to 90 days from transplants, and that's really going to depend on the variety. So they are one of the most important commercial vegetables that are out there, and you'll see they're available all year round. Thankfully, you can actually grow them hydroponically, which is fantastic. That helps control some of the issues that we have. But yeah, they are, definitely one of the most important commercial crops out there. There are over 3,000 different species. So that's kind of impressive. I mentioned that there were quite a few. Not all of them are grown here in this country, but know that there are an awful lot out there. They are a good source of vitamins. So whenever your mom used to tell you to eat your vitamins, you could definitely eat your tomatoes and that would count. I know growing up as a child, my mom liked to can a lot, and she would often can a lot of tomatoes. And sometimes she would just pour them into a bowl and we would eat tomatoes, canned tomatoes like that. Sounds a little unusual, but we liked it. I liked it. Anyway, you have all sorts of different types of products that come from tomatoes. It's going to be canned tomatoes, tomato juice, ketchup, tomato paste, all sorts of stuff, sun-dried tomatoes, and oil-based tomatoes that you use in cooking, all sorts of stuff. So now we're going to move into the how to plant, maintain, harvest, that kind of stuff. So the whens and the hows. Seedlings are going to be planted pretty much middle to late spring, kind of after the danger of frost. I know we all want to get them in there as soon as possible. We'll talk a little bit about that. But because they are a tropical plant, they do need to go in after the danger of frost. So we do have to kind of keep that in the back of our head. Sometimes people get these packets of tomato seeds, and if you're a new gardener, you may look at those and go, oh, those are really beautiful. I'll just drop those in the soil and grow them after the danger of frost. You can do that, but we do have a lot of disease. We have high temperatures, high humidity, all sorts of things that kind of are against tomatoes in general. So what most people are going to do is they're either going to purchase them as transplants at the nursery or what local community garden or something like that, farmers market, or they're going to grow them themselves at home. And either is an option. I don't personally know anyone that starts tomatoes by seed out in the garden, but that, you could try that. It would just be really long time before you actually got any tomatoes. So you really have to think about what temperatures it needs to be outside before you actually put them out there. And believe it or not, there are parts of the country that it's just too cool. The Pacific Northwest has a really difficult time getting temperatures, soil temperatures, and air temperatures high enough to actually grow tomatoes. So usually if you're going to grow them over there, it's going to be in a greenhouse situation. Down here in the South, a lot of times we'll look for larger transplants. For instance, I have some disease issues in my garden, and a lot of times late blight will take out my tomatoes. So I might go looking for a larger 1-gallon tomato plant so that it's already big and it has a head start. So that by the time we run into July and August, when it's really hot and it's really humid, and a lot of the diseases kind of get kickstarted, I'll already have been harvesting tomatoes and I will have already gotten a crop. You also want to kind of consider your source of transplants. And as I mentioned before, you can get them pretty much anywhere. I mean, obviously, the big box stores will carry a lot of transplants, but mentioning the disease aspects, some of the larger greenhouses have problems with that. And since we have an issue with humidity and the perfect conditions for disease and the disease triangle, that being conditions, the plant, and the organism itself, you might want to consider starting from seed so that you control a lot of that, or buying from a reputable source locally that also does the same. So moving on, there are different types or varieties of tomatoes. And so those kind of fit into the time period of like, when are you going to expect harvest? So for instance, early girl, some of you may grow that. That's going to be an early season variety. And that usually takes less than 70 days to get from germination to maturity. Mid-season, that's going to be 70 to 80 days. And late season is going to be longer than 80 days. Some of the bigger tomatoes like the beefsteak, those are going to be the ones that take a little bit longer. So if you're new to growing tomatoes, you might have heard the words determinate and indeterminate tossed around and not really known what in the world that actually means. Well, let's go through what that actually means. So determinate tomatoes are going to kind of be genetically set. They're not going to get as tall or as big as indeterminate, meaning they have a determined height that they're going to reach. In this case, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, if you allow them, the vines, to actually get that tall. They're going to stop growing once the flower buds emerge. So basically what it boils down to is they're going to produce one big crop of fruit that's going to be available to pick. Roma tomatoes are an example of that, and they all come due at about the same amount of time. So within 2 to 4 weeks of each other. So for instance, if you love to cook spaghetti sauce, you might plant a bunch of Roma tomatoes, and then that way they're all ripe at about the same time. You can harvest them all. You can can your sauce, however you want to do that. And then you're done. You don't have to worry about picking a little bit here and picking a little bit there all through the summer. Indeterminate is basically what it sounds like. Those are going to continue to grow, those vines are, and they're going to set flowers all throughout the season. So as long as the temperatures are what tomatoes need, and again, we'll go into that a little bit more, they're going to continue to grow. You're going to see the vines get longer. They're going to get fuller as long as you don't have disease issues also. And they will continue to flower and they will continue to fruit so that you can pick them. They're going to produce shoots and suckers. And so we'll talk a little bit about pruning so that you can maximize growth of fruit. But they ultimately will end up somewhere anywhere from like 10 to 12 feet tall and long. So types of tomatoes. So because we're the hotbed of disease down here in Atlanta, we have to throw the disease-resistant tomatoes in. So these are probably a more recent type of tomato. And these tomatoes have been bred to be disease-resistant. So if you're looking at a package of seed or you're looking at a tag, then you're going to look for, and we'll say you have problems with these specific diseases in your garden, you're going to look for something that has an F. F means Fusarium wilt resistant. Now, resistant doesn't mean that it can't succumb to that disease. It just means that it takes a little bit longer. Verticillium resistant, that's going to be a V. N is nematode resistant. A T is going to be tomato mosaic virus resistant. An A is going to be alternaria blight resistant. That's late blight, I believe, early or late blight. It's in here. Anyway, I'll be able to cover it. Then you have your midget or your patio or dwarf varieties. These are a lot of times used in container gardens. So if you're in an apartment or a condo or a small house, a cluster home, and you don't have a lot of space, maybe just a bit of a patio, you can put these particular varieties in large containers. They don't get very big. They're very compact growing. A lot of times we'll see them at the big box stores. They already come with the little plastic cage and they're already bearing fruit, and they don't get very big, but they are very productive. So these make really good patio versions or containers. Then we have cherry and grape tomatoes. So those are going to be very tiny, tiny little tomatoes like that, good for salads. They come in all sorts of different colors, and they're very, very prolific. Then you're going to have your beefsteak varieties. Those are going to be your very large slicing tomatoes for BLTs and hamburgers, things like that. And then your paste tomatoes, those are going to be like your elongated kind of meaty tomatoes like Romas, like I was talking about, that was a determinate tomato. And then, of course, the ones everybody loves, those are your heirlooms. They're the older ones. They've been around forever, open pollinated, very rarely resistant to fungal diseases, unfortunately. My poor garden is a hotbed of disease, like I mentioned, and I would love to be able to grow some of the heirlooms in there, but I have to grow the resistant varieties because they're gone by this time, they're usually dead. Even some of the resistant varieties I have bad luck with. It's really heartbreaking. Okay, so let's say you want to start your seeds inside. Know that I do have a seed starting presentation that is actually up on the Metro Master Gardener YouTube channel. I'll try to present that about once a year for folks that want to get the live version and maybe have questions to ask. This is just a very short, abbreviated version of that one. That one is, of course, an hour, and it goes much more in depth into starting seeds and how you do it and all of that. So this, again, is just going to be very short, but feel free if you have questions, drop them in the chat box, or I can answer those live. So with tomatoes, you're going to start those about, 3 months, I would say mid-January, probably 10 to 12 weeks before the last spring frost date. So those of you that are master gardeners that are on here, and maybe some of your other folks that are on here might know that we recently changed from 7B over here in Gwinnett to 8A. So that's a bit of a difference in the last official frost date. So 7B is going to be about April 15th, tax day. That's been kind of the rule of thumb for many, many years. And now, as 8A, it's March 15th. I'm not sure I believe that. Take that with a grain of salt, but somewhere in between is probably safe. And honestly, if you watch the weather, the weather forecasters will have a fairly decent idea about 10 days out, give or take, if they expect any below freezing weather. So they can see the trends, and that should tell you whether you should hold off or whether you're okay to plant. So with starting tomato seeds, it's pretty much the same as any other seed that you're going to start. Initially, when you first start doing this, you don't have to spend a lot of money. You can see at the picture in the top right, you've got a sandwich container, you've got some of those little peat pots, and you're just starting seeds in there. And it makes for a really good little greenhouse. So if you're going to reuse and recycle, that's a good thing to do if you have donut containers or salad containers, things like that are going to be plastic and act like little greenhouses. So you just kind of pre-soak those seeds in warm water to kind of start the germination process. You're going to use some type of moistened seed starting or potting mix. Those aren't going to have a lot of more expensive nutrients that you might need for a different type of plant, because usually at some point you're going to have to transplant. So make sure you look for seed starting mix. And then you're going to just sprinkle a couple of seeds on the top of each of those little peat pellets, or if you've got a tray like up in the top left, you can just sprinkle 2 or 3 seeds on the top of the mix in those containers. Cover a little bit in soil and spritz with water if you've got a spray bottle. You can, if you've got the shell like you used for a donut container, you can put that on a sunny windowsill. That usually fits really nice. Maybe you'd like to invest in a seed warming mat like you see there in the middle. It's just a constant 70 degrees or so all the time, and you just plug it in and it keeps your seeds warm and it helps with germination. They're not terribly expensive. Might be a good investment for you. So after your tomato seeds have sprouted, you're going, after the first leaves appear, not the true leaves, but just the seed leaves, you're going to remove that cover. And then you're going to move them under some grow lights. Because keep in mind, if you're doing this in January, the days are still short, the nights are still long. There's not a whole lot of light flowing through the windows. So really, those seeds need a little extra help. You can purchase different types. There's LED grow lights, there's fluorescent grow lights, but basically they've got to have that red and blue wavelength that they need, the plants need, in order to grow. As I mentioned, again, in the seed starting presentation I have, we go into that a lot more than we do here, but just know that you do need those two types of wavelengths for plants to be happy and grow. So it can't just be a regular incandescent bulb. You have to have special grow lights. And you probably want some kind of a timer because you're going to turn them off at night. You're just trying to mimic growing conditions that you would have in nature. Keep that soil moist by misting. You don't need to fertilize until the second set of true leaves appear. So when you look at those plants up in the very top right, those are just seed leaves. Those are not the true leaves. Your true leaves are going to be what you see in the other seedlings and the other pictures here on this page. So then you're going to fertilize at about half strength every 2 weeks. So you just want them to grow, but you don't want them to grow crazy like your lawn in the summer. So there's a little bit of nitrogen in there to help with the green growth. And to encourage strong stems, you can kind of rub your hand back and forth across the top. Similar to, and I'll just throw this in there too, with trees, some people get really worried about their trees and they stake them. No need to do that. Same principle here. The wind will cause the same thing, and it will actually help strengthen the cells in the stem there or in the trunk. So there's your bit of trivia. All right, hardening off tomato seedlings. Some of you may know what hardening off is, some of you may not. So basically what hardening off means is that if you've been growing them inside where it's nice and climate controlled, you're going to acclimate them by stressing them a little bit, the little seedlings, to the outside. And that's going to help them get used to being transplanted, being outside, because the conditions outside are highly variable compared to what they were at inside. You could have colder temperatures, you could have, colder soil. Basically what you're trying to do is prevent transplant shock. I've had a call earlier this spring where somebody purchased some nice, beautiful transplants from a plant sale. And they didn't harden off those seedlings. And then they basically had some cold temperatures and lost about half of what was there. So they didn't know that that's what they should have done. And she was kind of unhappy about it, but she laughed and said that it gave her a chance to go out and buy some more plants. So for some of us gardeners, that's what we look for anyway. We just want an opportunity to go buy more plants. But basically, you want to reduce the amount of watering, stop fertilizing, and then about 10 days, 2 weeks, give or take, before transplanting, you're going to take those plants and move them outside into a shady kind of protected area, a little microclimate, if you will, for a few hours. And you're going to increase that time outside by about an hour a day so that they get used to the growing conditions outside. And that way, by the time you're ready to move them outside permanently, they are used to that. They're not going to have that transplant shock, and they'll be fine. So putting them in the soil. Tomatoes are going to need about 8 hours of sun per day. So if you have a patio, and you want to put a tomato there, it's got to have at least 8 hours of sun. If you have a garden, at least 8 hours of sun. These are tropical plants, and they need that really high intensity sunlight in order to do well. They really need to have a fairly high humidity. So most of us in our house are going to feel most comfortable at probably, 30 to 40% humidity, maybe a little less. Any less than that, and it starts to dry out, and we're not very comfortable, and neither are plants. I swear at the office, it's like a 25% humidity, and those things get sucked dry. They wilt like 2 days after I water them. It's very frustrating, but plants have the same issue outside. So that would be more like if you were living in Arizona or some of the desert areas. It's hard to keep them moist, but tomatoes like 65 to 85% humidity, and we've got plenty of that around here. So usually that's not a problem. The only problem is that with humidity, you end up with higher incidences of disease, usually fungal issues, sometimes bacteria, depends. And also it has issues with lower pollen releasing and distribution, because the hotter it is, that doesn't, it's clumps, and it's not able to be moved around as well as it should. They also have to have a pH that's probably 6 to 6.8. So if you've had them in your soil, like in ground, not in a raised bed, and they've not been doing very well, you might want to consider a soil test, and that's what that bag is in the upper left corner. If you're in ground and you haven't done any amendments to the soil, it's quite possible your pH might be lower than that. Here in Georgia, with all this heavy clay, a lot of times the pH is going to hover in the 5.5 to 6 range. So you might be a little bit low on pH, and that might be limiting the tomatoes and what kind of nutrients they can uptake. So if you are starting a brand new garden, in-ground garden, or you've had one for years and you're not real happy with how your plants look, now's a good opportunity to get a soil test. Extension can help you with that. Just give us a call, and we can tell you how to collect that sample, and then you bring it down to the office. We send that off. It's only $8, super cheap, and it'll help you understand what you need to do to amend your soil. We recommend you do it about every 3 to 5 years. And also that'll tell you if you need to add lime, or in the case of one person who added a lot of wood ash, he thought he was helping his wife out, but it ended up hurting her plants. He actually adjusted the pH from that wood ash all the way up to almost 10. Most plants cannot handle that. So we don't want to love our plants to death. And it's always a good idea to know what we're working with, so we know if we need to adjust the pH down to where the plants, whatever plant that's going to be, is going to be happy. And I have a little line in there about not adding gypsum until a soil test shows deficiency. That goes for everything. I know sometimes people want to proactively add in Epsom salts or something else because they've heard through the grapevine that that sweetens the fruit, or is something that the plants need. They may not need that. That's why you get the soil test, so that you can kind of get an idea of what's already there, so that you know if you need to add something or not. Because a lot of times, you want to add these fertilizers and your soil doesn't need that. Sometimes when you have too much of something, that will run off. All I have to do is show you a picture of a golf course lot with a pond in it and all the algae to know that sometimes those nutrients do run off. They're not used by the plants, and then it ends up in the waterways and can be a problem. So you have to be careful about that. But anyway, you're going to plant outside when your soil temperatures are a solid 60 degrees or warmer. So that's, late spring. But your optimum growing temperatures are going to be between 71 and 84 degrees. Anything less than about 57, and they're just going to stay there. They're not growing. They're not producing any flowers. They're not doing anything. So trying to get a jump on planting them in the spring is not really going to help you out. And of course, adding organic matter to the soil to kind of help improve water holding abilities. And if you have heavy clay soil, that's going to be a good thing. That's good for the roots of the plant. Okay, transplanting. So just as a rule of thumb, if you can, rotate the location of your tomatoes. I do it like every year. Here it says every 3 to 4 years, but that's designed to help break the disease cycle in some cases where you have a lot of disease. If you're planting, if you have a really large garden, maybe a quarter acre, so you're lucky. You've got a lot of ground to work with, and you can really do a lot of crop rotation. But realistically, in a community garden where you have a bed, you may not be able to do that. So you'll just have to kind of flip flop one end to the other end. You're going to plant these about 18 to 24 inches apart with 3 to 4 foot between rows. So again, if you're in a community garden, that means that you probably can plant one on one end and one on the other. Now, I've seen community rows in some of these community gardens that have tons of tomatoes smushed together. And, you have to be it's more labor intensive. You're going to have to do more scouting for disease, more scouting for insects, things like that, because things are a lot thicker. But there are some things that you can do. I talked about pruning, so I'll go into that a little bit more. And you're going to dig a hole. You're going to remove those lower leaves. So tomatoes are going to have those little knobby things. Those are called adventitious roots. And so you can actually plant that tomato a little deeper in the soil, and those adventitious roots will actually start to grow out into the soil. Some people like to lay them down sideways. You can kind of see that up in the top right. And that's okay too. There's different methods for doing that. I like to just, plant them a little bit deeper. I maybe put them in 6 inches deeper. I'll prune off the lower branches and then place them deeper, and then cover them with soil. And I'll put some type of mulch hay or pine star or something on top of them. And that's to help with the splashback of any soil, because like I mentioned, I have a lot of disease issues. But there's a lot of reasons why you would want to put mulch on there. Make sure to add some water into that hole to help with that plant's roots. Hopefully when you're putting them in there, they're nice and moist. And you're going to form a little bit of a berm around there so that any rainwater gets caught in there. And then again, add that mulch. That's going to prevent splashback. It's going to keep that soil moisture nice. And then as that mulch decomposes, it adds back nutrients to the soil. The sun will break down that organic matter. And so you need to return that organic matter to the soil every so often, because it'll become deficient in that. And really tomatoes, because they're heavy producers, they need about 1 to 2 inches of water a week. So make sure if it is not raining that you are out there watering. You never want to overhead water on a tomato. You always want to water down by the root system. Again, I mentioned that disease can be a really big issue. So we want to give that plant every chance that we possibly can at not getting a disease. Containers, these are the types that I mentioned before, the dwarf patio or bush, those are going to be better choices for containers. Again, they still need the same amount of sun, 6 to 8 hours, and choose some type of a sterile potting mix. So just get yourself a bag of potting soil. Try to avoid those dark colored containers. It's really hot here. You don't want to cook the root system, but just kind of take that into account. And you really want to use a bigger one. So at least 5 gallons in size, but bigger is always better. A lot of times people just get a 5-gallon bucket from the big box stores, and you can set up little bucket gardens on your deck or your patio. There's some really neat little designs out online that you can get. Water daily, and sometimes more than once a day in hot weather when the evaporation rate is high. And make sure that you're feeding fertilizer pretty regularly, because they are heavy feeders, very heavy feeders. And if you don't have pollinator plants nearby, make sure that you're shaking those plants a little bit so that you can pollinate. Pollination is complicated. If you are new to an area and your neighbors don't have a lot of flowers, or they just have regular old landscape planting, pollinators have a memory, so they know where to go in order to find the flowers that they need for their food. And if you are the lone garden holder in a sea of people that don't do that, you're like an oasis. They may not find you. It's like bumbling around in the desert looking for that water hole. You have to have flowers year after year. So encourage your neighbors to put pots of flowers out, uh, garden plants out somewhere, interplant, put them in between in your landscape. Just to, make it a subdivision wide or a condo wide goal to have everybody at least have one pot of flowers or something. That's great for the pollinators, and it's great for you if you're growing tomatoes. Okay, support for indeterminate tomatoes. So just a side note here, because they continue to grow, they can get pretty lanky, very leggy. There's a lot of different ways you can grow indeterminate tomatoes. Some people will spiral them up, and they'll have a line up at the top, and then they'll have a string that comes down, and they will twist them around that line. Remember, these are kind of vining plants, so that is an option. Stakes or cages, you don't want that plant crawling along the ground, okay? It will root. Remember those little adventitious roots I talked about? It will root. Also, when it's in contact with the ground, that's more contact with disease. So you want to try to prevent that. You can get a cattle panel. I've seen that at a lot of the Harvest Gwinnett gardens. And you can bend that around into like a cylinder. You can use the Florida weave, that's down at the bottom, or use twine and string. You kind of weave that back and forth, and the tomatoes in between, and that kind of holds it up. And then as that plant grows, you just make another layer. You can tie or clip vines, like you see in that top right. That plastic clip is clipping to a piece of twine that's supported from overhead. That's a good way to do it in a greenhouse situation. There's different options. If you need help with that, you can always reach out. Pruning, so pinching off shoots. Tomatoes will grow really fast. It's okay. So don't feel like you can't. It's going to give you better air circulation. You can see in that top picture that plant has been pinched off to allow that. And it's going to also help promote earlier production. And you might be able to prune off some plants that might already have disease. And it's also going to control the size of any tomatoes in containers. So there is a reason why you should prune your tomatoes. Don't be afraid of it. They will grow very quickly and bush out very easily. So it's perfectly fine. You're going to start pruning that tomato plant when it's about 18 inches and fairly well developed. So when the first flowers start to show up. I would always recommend taking your pruners and kind of spritzing them with an alcohol mix, and that's to help with any sanitation. Just on the off chance that you have some type of fungal issue around and it gets on those clippers, you don't want to introduce that to your tomato. So that will make sure that you kind of help wash that off, if you will. Do it when the plants are dry. You don't want to do it when they're wet. Lots of disease spreads when it's damp or very humid. And do note that determinate plants, those are the ones that only grow and then kind of stop and produce one crop, don't really need to be pruned. They have kind of a maximum height that they will attain. So kind of determine where you want 1, 2, or 3 main leaders. Locate suckers. And those are going to be between in the leaf and the stem. And then you're going to pinch those off, or you're going to use pruners. And you can root those if you want more tomato plants. Some people might want that. I don't know. I don't have enough space for that. But you don't want to remove any more than about 1/3 of the foliage on this plant, especially during hot, dry weather. You're going to have a lot of evapotranspiration as the water leaves that plant. It needs to be able to replace that. You want to also make sure that you have plenty of leaves left on that plant, because when you start getting into June and July where the sun is more intense, then you're going to end up with sun scald if you remove too much vegetation. Setting fruit, tomatoes are self-pollinating. They have male and female parts in the same flower. They have to be fertilized within 50 hours after blossoming. So again, if you don't have a lot of pollinators, get out there, get a paintbrush, electric toothbrush, something to jiggle that. Bumblebees will get in there and they vibrate to knock that pollen loose. But if you want fruit, you've got to do that. High summer temperatures, as note, if you got your tomatoes in later, once you hit temperatures like what we have right now, that plant's going to stop. It's just going to kind of go into stasis. Tomato pollen then becomes basically sterile and it's going to drop its flowers. It's not going to set any fruit. Now, when those temperatures start to decrease and they drop down below 90, it will start up again. So right now, your tomato plants aren't doing a whole lot of anything. They're just kind of hanging out. And hopefully you're still watering them, but they aren't setting any new fruit at this point. So temperatures below 55 to 60 degrees, that's also going to interfere with pollen production. And you might end up with cat facing, which is this. So that's a cat facing, and that's going to be where basically that blossom adheres to that tomato plant. You'll see that sometimes in more temperate climates, usually not here. I see it sometimes up in the mountains when I go up there to the Osage Farmers Market, but that's where the blossom adheres. And you also might want to consider planting pollinating plants in between. I mentioned again the electric toothbrush. If you don't have any pollinators, but that's a good way to get them in to just have nature do it for you. Fertilizing, they're very heavy feeders. So you have to continually feed them, whether that be Miracle-Gro or you have a time-release granular that you put out there when you plant it. Side dress with about 2 tablespoons per plant, something with a 10-20-10 fertilizer. That's your NPK ratio. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Phosphorus is fruits, flowers, that kind of thing. So you need to make sure that it has plenty of fertilizer, and then you want to go ahead and fertilize again. So second application is going to be about 2 weeks after ripe fruit, and then third application a month after that. So they use a lot of fertilizer, a lot. And I think some people kind of underestimate. So maybe they're not getting as many fruits as they had hoped. Okay, maintenance, pull weeds, competing for moisture, prune suckers, tie the tomatoes to the stakes for support, insect and disease damage, so constantly scouting, water frequently to keep your tomatoes growing so you don't have splitting, that kind of thing. we have such up and down rainfall patterns here that you probably are going to end up with a lot of splitting. I mean, we had a couple weeks with no rain at all. Now we're getting a little bit. So if you have tomatoes out there, they're probably going to have a big burst of growth. So just keep it consistent. Companion plants, I'm not going to go too much here. I'm going to continue to move on. But if you are really curious, you can go visit this publication. And these are just a sampling. They have all sorts of other ones there, but it's kind of interesting. I mean, some of them are great for repelling particularly bad insects. Some of them are going to provide nutrients. Some of them are going to act as a mulch. Some attract, some types of insects that are predatory that will take care of some of the bad insects. There's all sorts of reasons. So check that out. And you can always, like I said, you can go to the Metro Master Gardener YouTube channel and pull up that later. Okay, so now we're going to move into the common pests. And again, I'm not going to go, I've got about 15, 20 minutes left. So I'm not going to go super in depth, but these are going to be the pests and then the diseases that you're going to see most frequently. It is not a 100% inclusive list. And I have provided QR codes with information, publications from other extension agencies, where you can go read all about the life cycles, about controls. So basically what you see here is just going to be a very abbreviated synopsis of the insect that I'm talking about. So first we'll kind of go over tomato fruitworm or the corn earworm. So yes, it's kind of the same insect, and it doesn't really care if it's eating corn or if it's eating tomatoes, but it can do a lot of damage and destruction. So I know they do mention don't plant your corn and your tomatoes really close to each other because they will be happily jumping back and forth. The larva will chew the leaves if there's no fruit available, but when the fruit is available, they will jump right over to that fruit and burrow into it. And then you're going to have, shedding skins and frass, which is caterpillar poop inside the tomato. You can't eat it. So you don't want to lose your fruit crop. Parasitic wasps are helpful. You can see a picture on that tomato hornworm down below, that parasitic wasp larva. You can also use BT, that's Bacillus thuringiensis. You have to spray that on leaves and then it'll eat that. It causes several different kind of reactions and it will kill the caterpillar. But you have to reapply that after each rain. The tomato hornworm, so that's the larva of the five-spotted hawk moth. And not this particular one, but hawk moths are also called hummingbird moths. So those of you that are out a lot of times with a butterfly bush or a buddleia, those, if you see a picture there, it's right next to the caterpillar down below. Those guys are out during the day. Most moths are nocturnal, meaning they're out at night, but these guys are out during the day. So if you have a butterfly bush and you see what looks like a hummingbird, and you get a little closer and you look at it, you're like, that is not a hummingbird. It's probably a hawk moth or a hummingbird moth. So I personally have a love-hate relationship with these guys. I like to be able to just plant a couple extra tomato plants and let them munch away. My daughter has had a couple of science experiments where she's taken these guys and put them in a plastic shoebox and allowed them to pupate and then emerge and become a hawk moth, and fly away. And it's kind of interesting to watch. So sometimes people just say pick them and squish them. That's entirely up to you. I try to kind of live and let live with nature as best as I can. But you have to do you. So they do have alternative host plants, potato, eggplant, and peppers, and that's because they're all in the same family. So you might be able to move them over to another plant. Know that there are also some for hydrangeas and gardenias and several other different types, but they are host specific. And so these need plants in that same Solanaceae family. The caterpillars are going to grow in the dark with the UV. So you can see there's a picture of that down below. So if you can't find them, they are experts at camouflage. You might be able to take a black light out at night and find them that way. And then, as I mentioned, when they're mature, they drop off into the ground, they burrow in down a couple inches, and they will pupate and emerge about 10 days to 3 weeks later in the summertime to form another moth, and then they will fly off and complete their life cycle again. Nematodes, so those are going to attack the roots. Root knot nematodes, you can see a picture of those in the top right. They basically make it impossible for the plant to pull nutrients and water from the soil. And that's what they look like. They just little worms, basically. So the plant will become stunted. It can't grow because it can't get nutrients. Please mute yourself.
I'll take my car to my movie.
And it's going to produce fewer and smaller fruits. Aphids, those are the ones below. They're very small. We have them a lot of times in the early summer, June, time period, May, June. They're not just on garden plants, they are on everywhere, it seems like. And those have an interesting generational. They're asexual at first. The females will reproduce, and then males after that. You can usually spray them off, sometimes insecticidal soap, that kind of thing.
That smell.
Sorry, I had to mute that person. And then leaf-footed bugs. So those are going to be the top left. Those are really annoying, and they do like to get on tomatoes, and they use that sucking proboscis to suck out the juices, and they leave behind kind of this foul taste. I love using trap crops for these. Sunflowers are great. So if you plant them opposite from where your tomatoes are, sometimes you can lure them away because they like the sunflowers more. Just know that all this information is going to be in those publications if you want to check those out. All right. White flies. This is a problem not only in the garden, but also in greenhouses. They're going to suck the juices out of the leaves. The underside of the leaves, they secrete honeydew, and then you end up with this black fungus. It's going to weaken the plant, and then they're more susceptible to other diseases. Just a really big problem. They're very small. You can see what they look like. That's just a magnified version, but you can read about them there. Mealybugs, they're very slow moving. They've got that cottony, kind of waxy stuff. They've been bad this spring. I have them on a bunch of different plants, and they're very annoying also. And you can use, there are some biocontrols. There's a mealybug destroyer beetle, and you can also use some types of chemicals. They're in growth regulators for them. So they keep them in the nymph stage. They're not ever allowed to grow up and repopulate. Spider mites, usually you're going to see like a classic stippling. The spider mite is kind of a blown up version there. They're very, very tiny. If mites are suspected, the way we tell people to test is you're going to take a white piece of paper, you're going to put it underneath the leaf or the pine tree or whatever it is, and then tap it. And if you get stuff that falls off and it moves, it's probably a spider mite. So you can use water if you're looking for organic methods, a strong jet of water to knock them off, but you can also use horticulture oils and insecticidal soaps. Okay, moving on to common diseases. So common diseases of tomatoes, let me count the ways. This is not an all-inclusive list, and there are a lot of diseases. I've tried to put pictures here, but again, I've got publications tied to each of these. The QR code will take you to a university-based publication that has way more information than I can provide here. This is just meant to be kind of a very short synopsis of that. But if you suspect you have some of this, you can always reach out to us. We're happy to take a look at what you've got going on and try to give you a diagnosis. So Fusarium wilt, that's coming from a soil-borne fungus. And that's why I said it's always good to prune out all of those lower branches on a tomato and then use some type of mulch, because what that'll do is that'll help prevent any of those spores that are in the soil from splashing up onto those leaves that are really close to the base. So if you prune out that bottom, I don't know, what is that, about 10 inches? If you prune out that bottom 10 inches or maybe 12 inches of stems and leaves, then you eliminate some of that splashback. And then if you put mulch down over the top of that, you eliminate even more. So if you don't have a problem, it can help prevent you from getting a problem. Um, you can look for some of these, as I mentioned, if you look for something that has a fusarium wilt, it'll have like an F if it's semi-resistant to it. So you can look for that resistance on the tag or on the seed envelope. Verticillium wilt, that's going to be another fungal disease, and it's going to start by yellowing of older leaves and then wilting, leaf drop, and then stunting of the plant and fruit. So you're going to look for a V as in victory for resistant varieties. And there are publications online that you can get where they talk about the different resistant varieties. So if you have diseases in your garden, you'll want to be looking for those. And it may make sense for you to start your own by seed at home, because then you can grow the resistant varieties that you need and you don't have to worry about it. I have that problem. Snellville, over at Snellville Farmers Market, one of our master gardeners, Wes Nettleton, he's over at the Snellville community garden, and he grows some of these resistant varieties and then sells them there. So I typically will buy mine from him. Late blight or Phytophthora. So late blight, it's going to be especially damaging during cooler, wetter weather. So like last summer, we had a fairly cool summer, and we had some of these issues later on in the summer because it was a milder summer. So you can see some of the pictures there, the lesions on the leaves that you get. You can end up with the plant completely defoliated within about 2 weeks. So you're going to end up with lesions on the fruit. Make sure that you're spacing plants. And if you do have a plant, remove it, one that has it, get it out of the garden. Don't compost it, throw it away. There are resistant varieties. Make sure you're using those, and you always want to space those tomatoes. Make sure that you're spacing them as far apart as you possibly can. Ultimately, if you can not have them touching each other, that's probably a good thing. Next up, damping off. This is usually seedlings, and you're going to get a fungus or a mold in the soil. That's why we don't recommend reusing soil unless you're sterilizing it, because you can end up with that fungus or mold. And then all these little seedlings you work so hard to grow, they die. So there's no cure. Just throw that batch out, sanitize your containers, and start over again. Bacterial wilt. So this one is where the bacterium is in the soil, and what it does is it gains entry through insect feeding damage, or if you were pruning, something like that. It's getting into that plant somehow, and then it's going to rapidly multiply. It loves it when it's hot and humid outside, and it's going to fill up the pithy interior of that stem, and it clogs up the vascular system of that plant. And so if you can see the little tube there with water in it, you can see that milky stuff that's kind of coming down. That's all the bacteria. So it's clogged up the vascular system. You see a picture of that in below there, where it's kind of brown on the interior, and then the plant wilts. So it just hits a point, it can't suck up any more moisture from its roots, and it dies because it's basically just been cut off from all of its nutrients and its water. Early blight, Alternaria blight. So this one, you're going to see the brown lesions. Anytime you see brown lesions on leaves, it's almost a guarantee that some type of fungal spot. You might have leaf scorch from sun. There are a few other reasons, but generally speaking, it's most likely going to be some type of a fungal issue. It's just what kind. Um, High temperatures and humidity like what we have, it's just what happens. So you want to try to keep this out of your garden if you possibly can. That the lesions, they can girdle that plant if they're down in the lower part of that stem near the soil line. And that fungus survives on an affected debris. So make sure that you're practicing good garden hygiene. Rake all that stuff up, get it out of there. You don't want to put that in the compost heap. So to kind of control this using resistant varieties, rotate, get rid of weeds where it may overwinter, volunteer plants, that kind of thing. Septoria leaf spot, again, another leaf spot. Except in this one, the fruit isn't really getting infected. It's just the leaves. But what you can end up with problems of is that, the leaves can turn yellow and die and fall off. And then what fruit you have end up with scorch. So you can't really eat them anyway because they're basically cooked in the sun. But it's going to be most active when temperatures are going to be like 68 to 77, give or take. So it was kind of a problem last year. Like I mentioned, we had a fairly mild summer. So it was a bigger issue then. So most tomato plants, cultivars, are going to be susceptible to this. Just make sure that you're doing your crop rotation and sanitation. Don't use overhead irrigation with any of these. You can try, and I've done this successfully, you use repeated fungicide applications before you get the fungus. Mancozeb, that's one, some sulfurs, that kind of thing. You want to put a barrier up to infection, so sometimes you can control it. Bacterial spot, that's going to infect peppers and green but not red tomatoes, which is unusual. Mostly you're going to see that in wet seasons. So this is a Xanthomonas. But again, this is going to be little kind of, you're going to see the spots on the fruit like what you see there. Leaf spots may have a halo. So again, fungal or bacterial, we can kind of help you. We can always send off pictures to our plant clinic for 100% diagnosis if we're not sure. But yeah, make sure that you're getting rid of the vegetation that's showing symptoms like this. Anthracnose, there's anthracnose in a lot of different plants. So when you see it on the fruit, you're going to start seeing these small circular indented areas. It's diseased. It's pretty much eaten through the fruit. You really can't do a whole lot about it. You're going to want to look for disease-free seed. And if you've gotten some seed and you don't know if it's disease-free, you can treat it, soak it in hot water for about 25 minutes to kill that fungus before you grow it out. Southern blight, this is not, we don't see this as much. Sometimes this is in production, but this one, it'll girdle it at the stem level and it grows pretty quick. It's not common, like I mentioned. You're going to see it in temperatures over 85 degrees, but I did just see one come in, a picture of one. So it is out there. You just have to be vigilant. Tomato spotted wilt virus. This is a virus. It's transmitted by thrips. So if you see the stippling kind of feeding damage on the leaves like you see there, that's thrip damage, and it can be transmitted via those bugs. So it's going to be most active when it's a little bit cooler. So earlier in the spring or maybe later in the fall. And when the humidity is high with maybe a lot of rainfall, which is not right now, but, or if there's overhead irrigation. You can't cure it. So try to prevent it from spreading to uninfected plants. You might choose to remove those. Tomato yellow leaf curl virus. We see this every so often, transmitted by the whitefly, and it can infect other plants in the Solanaceae family. So peppers, potatoes, eggplants, it can infect those. And that's going to lead to damage. And you see there, it gets a little bit whiter and brighter, and then the leaves will curl and it'll die. And pith necrosis, I did see one like this yesterday or the day before. So again, it's going to basically clog up the vascular system of the plant. And you can see this, one of the symptoms is those little adventitious roots down on the bottom there. They kind of go crazy and they start growing. And that's because the vascular system is clogged. So it's trying to save itself. Trees will do the same thing, identical. So plant matter across the board, it's trying to save itself as best as it can. All right, tomato facts. You can collect your own tomatoes, tomato seeds, and you can save them and allow them to ferment and then collect those and grow them later. So that works for heritage types of varieties and cat facing. So we already kind of talked about that one. That's when the blossom adheres to the end of the fruit at certain temperatures, blossom end rot, due to a calcium deficiency of the plant. Again, that's something that if you get a soil test, we can tell you that you're deficient in calcium and that you should fix that. But there are some foliar sprays that you can use to fix that temporarily. Too much nitrogen in the soil produces less favorable tomatoes, and potassium increases lycopene, which increases flavor. Did you know? And then tomato plants can produce a lot of flowers, but not fruits. Could be because of a lack of pollination, was why we encourage you to plant pollinating plants around so that you attract those bugs. Tomatoes often will split, like you see above, when you have inconsistent watering. So if you haven't been watering regularly, if you got some rain today or over the next couple days, expect your tomatoes to have splits. They most likely will. And tomato trivia. So this is the last bit. Believe it or not, tomatoes aren't always red. They can be yellow, pink, purple, black, and even white. That's interesting, huh? Disney World Resort, the largest single tomato plant in the world, covered 56.73 meters squared. That's bigger than an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And tomatoes originally came from Peru. I did mention South America. Did you know that Heinz tomato ketchup has a speed limit? If the sauce pours out at more than 0.02 miles per hour, then it's considered too runny and they throw it away. Who knew, right? La Domatina is an annual festival in Spain where people throw 150,000 tomatoes at each other. That could be funny. And then the largest tomato ever on record was picked in Oklahoma. It weighed 3.5 kilograms. That's more than a newborn baby. And Ohio, they love tomatoes so much that tomato juice is the official state drink. Who knew? There are about 100,000 varieties of tomatoes worldwide. And the first tomatoes in Europe were originally yellow, and they were referred to as pomodoro, meaning golden apple. And then tomatoes have been grown in space. So just a bit of tomato trivia for you. So I'll leave that up and I'll see if there's any questions in the chat. All right, let's see. I've got one. Tomatoes that do not turn red and remain yellow. There are yellow tomatoes. They tend to be lower in acid. I think it's Lemon Boy. That's the one that's probably most often found in the big box stores. There are, of course, other types, other cultivars of tomatoes out there that are yellow. There are grape tomatoes, cherry tomatoes that are yellow. There are some that are yellow and red striped. Mr. Stripey is one of those. There are some that are purple, Cherokee purple. That's a heritage variety. There are some that are so dark, they are almost black, and every color in between. So there's all sorts of different colors. There are some viruses that will inhibit the color and they will kind of stay yellow and not turn red. They'll have kind of a weird stippling color, and it'd be like the tomato mosaic virus. So if you suspect that, you can always take pictures and you can send them to us at the extension office. or when I post this, you can go and check out the QR code associated with that one. Blossom end rot. Is there a question about that, or you were just mentioning? Would you recommend snipping off suckers and planting them to create new plants? If so, what's the correct way to do that? So I keep mentioning the adventitious roots. So tomatoes have that ability to, those little knobbies on the sides of the stems, those roots, if you stick that sucker into soil, it will really quickly start to grow those adventitious roots. So if you have the space, or if you have a particular cultivar variety of tomato that you really like the flavor of, and you want more of it, you only put one plant in, and you're like, man, I wish I would have planted 2 or 3 more of those. Yeah, you can certainly go in and prune off a couple suckers and get you some 5-gallon buckets, and you can grow them in that, or put them directly in the soil, whichever you'd like to do. So they're pretty easy. Like I said, you don't have to really do a whole lot to them to get them to start growing roots. RE yellow, the plant that came from the Snellville Community Garden. I think Wes grows a bunch of different varieties. I mean, he grows a lot of different varieties over there. I didn't get any of the yellow ones. I'm sure he probably does grow some, but I'm not certain. Generally, they're going to have a tag on them, but you could probably reach out to him and he could tell you what it is. I think that's what you're asking. Let's see, what else? What type of mulch do you prefer to use for tomatoes? I generally use wheat straw. It will mulch, it will spread very evenly. You don't have to put a real thick layer on it. It will break down pretty quickly. So whatever you put on the layer of soil this year will be broken down and mixed in by next year. Straw bale gardening, that's one of the reasons why people use straw bales. You can use pine straw if you have pine straw in your yard and you want to use that. Feel free to use that. That's okay to use. The whole point just being is that you're trying to use some type of organic matter that will break down within a year or so, and will also protect that soil so that the evaporation rate drops and the splashback of any spores that might be in the soil are not a problem. How do you know when to pick tomatoes that are not red? So I assume you probably know what variety you planted. If you don't know what it looks like when it's ready to pick, you can probably take that variety name and just Google that, and it will show you what the mature version looks like. So obviously, if it's yellow, it's going to be yellow. If it's zebra striped, yeah, zebra striped, then Mr. Stripey is probably the one that's most often grown around here. And generally, that's going to be, it'll be kind of like pink, yellowish on the bottom. They're rather large, so they're like beefsteak size sometimes, and they'll have the red stripes on the top. You can go up and, I don't like squeezing them, but you can try slowly twisting it on the stem, and if it pops loose with a satisfying pop, it's probably ready. It's really hard to tell somebody when the right time to pick is, because I guess I just know when to pick. But usually if the color is fully developed for that particular cultivar, it's ready to pick. So if it's got striping on it right now, it's probably ready to pick. And there are some that are green and red striped. And then the Mr. Stripey, which is yellow and red striped. And there's some that are smaller, like grape-sized grape tomatoes, and then there's some that are bigger. So, I would say if it's kind of got a soft body to it, it's probably ready to pick. You don't want to get it too soft. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? Growing a variety that's expected to remain green when ripe. Wish me luck. That one, I would say if it's got a little bit of give to it when you're testing it, then it's probably ready to pick. And we all know you can always leave them on the windowsill a little bit, but that's interesting that it's completely green Yeah, we do have some interesting varieties of tomatoes, don't we? All right. Well, if anybody has any other questions, you can pop those in through the chat right now. I'll wait another minute or so. But if you want to check out the YouTube channel, like as I said, that's where I record everything and put that. And that QR code will take you there. If you want to look at our other class offerings, you can use that other QR code, and that'll take you to the other list of classes that we have coming up. I think it's up all the way through November. You met me at Lawrenceville. Okay. I have met a lot of people. It's one reason why I like my job. I get to meet so many nice and wonderful people. It's great. This is awesome. So, all right. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go ahead and end this. And thank you all for attending. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.